Hello, everyone. Today I'm going to story with you about the most ruthless king of the Chinese Empire, Chinese Emperor, that's both captivating and informative as well as soothing. We'll help you relax and get ready for sleep. Sit back in this story and drift off to sleep in peace. Subscribe and leave a comment telling me what time you watched it. Cameras a China. Narration script. The hook. Opening Nariri he buried scholars alive. He burned the books that held 4,000 years of human thought. He built a wall so vast that the bodies of the men who died constructing it were used as filler in its foundations. He conscripted hundreds of thousands of his own people into labor so brutal that contemporary accounts describe entire province emptied of their men. He unified a continent, standardized a language, created a currency, and built one of history's most enduring civilizations, and he did all of it in less than 12 years. His name was Ying Zheng. History would call him Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China, and by almost any measure applied across the span of recorded history, he am among the most ruthlessly effective and cruel rulers has ever known. This is his story, Part 1. The world before the emperor. To understand what Qin Shi Huang did to China. You must first understand what China was before him for over 500 years. The territory we now call China had been locked in a condition known to historians as the Warring Orange period. A sustained, grinding, multi-generational catastrophe of interstate warfare unlike almost anything else in the ancient world. 7 major states competed for supremacy across the Chinese heartland. Qin, Shu, Zhao, Wei, Han, Yan, and Qi. These were not small city-states squabbling over border villages. They were enormous political entities with armies numbering and the hundreds of thousands. With sophisticated bureaucracies, with philosophers and generals and engineers and sneers and spies. And they had been tearing each other apart, continuously and without resolution, since the 5th century BC. The scale of the violence staggering. Ancient Chinese records. Most of them, after the unification, and therefore viewed by historians with some caution, but corroborated by enough independent sources to be broadly reliable, describe individual battles in which Qi Kenangalese numbered in the hundreds of thousands. The Battle of Changping in 260 BC between the states and Zhao, the most discussed military engagements of the ancient world. Wu forces were surrounded and starved into surrender. The king general Bai Qi accepted the surrender of somewhere between 100,000 for 400,000 Zhao soldiers. The sources vary, and historians debate the numbers, and then had queued not killed in battle, executed after surrender as a deliberate active of strategic terror. This was the world Qin Shi Huang, a world where mass killing was not exceptional but routine, where the survival of a state undepended on its willingness to do things that other states found unthinkable, and where the state of Qin had over generations developed a political and military philosophy, legalism, that was colder, harder, and more systematically brutal than anything its rivals had produced. Qin was the westernmost of the major states, bordering the steppe and absorbing some of its ferocity. It was poorer than the wealthy eastern states. Its culture considered cruder by the refined courts of and Shu, but it had something the others lacked: a coherent ideology of state power that subordinated everything: morality, tradition, family, loyalty, human compassion, to the single goal of state efficiency. Under the philosopher-administrator Shang Yang, in the 4th century BC, Qin had reorganized itself from the foundation. Collective punishment was institutionalized. One man in a group of 5 committed a crime, and the others failed to report it. All 6 were punished. Military rank replaced aristocratic birth as the path to advancement. Agriculture and warfare were the only estate valued. Into this system, in 259 BC, Ying Zhang was born. Part 2.0. The chilled Wode will remake the world. The circumstances of Ying Zhang's birth are wrapped in a story that tells us something important about the world he entered. A story involving a merchant, concubine, and a question of paternity that would shadow the emperor for his entire life. His father was Zixu, a Qin prince who had been sent as a diplomatic hostage to the rival state of Zhao. A common practice in this period used to ensure compliance with treaties. Hostage princes lived in foreign courts in a condition of gilded captivity, comfortable enough, but politically precarious. Zixu's prospects of ever actually inheriting the Qin throne were slim. He was a minor prince, not in direct line of succession, and his years in Zhao had distanced him from the court politics that determined such things. Enter Lu Bue. He was a merchant, and in the rigidly hierarchical world of warring states China, a merchant, however wealthy, occupied a low social position. Commerce was considered parasitic by the Confucian and legalist philosophies that dominated elite thinking. But Lu Bue was not an ordinary merchant. He was, by any assessment, a political genius who understood that wealth was only the first step toward power. Lu Bue saw in the exiled Prince Zixu an investment opportunity of extraordinary potential. He befriended the prince, financed him, and, according to the historian Sima Qian, writing roughly a century after the events, gave Ziku his own favorite concubine, a dancer named Zhao Ji, who was already pregnant with Lu Bui's child. If Sima Qian's account is accurate, then Ying Zheng, the future first emperor of China, was not actually of royal kin blood at all, but the son of a merchant. The story became one of great of political scandals of Chinese history, circulated by the emperor's enemies, and never definitively resolved. What is historically certain is this: Lu Bui maneuvered Ziku back to Qin. Qin secured his position in the line of succession through extraordinary political skill. And when Ziku died in 2747 BC, after a reign of just 3 years, the boy Yingzeng, aged 13, became king of Qin. Lu Bui became regent, effectively the most powerful man in China, running the state at walled, while the child king learned the trade of power at his. What Lu Bui had not counted on was the nature of the student. Part 3. The making of Akadvincrant, the years of Yingzheng's minority, from his minority. From his accession at 13 to his assumption of direct personal rule at 22 were years of education in the most brutal school imaginable. He watched Lu Bui operate with the cold efficiency of a man who had spent his life treating as commodities to be bought, positioned, and discarded. He observed the court of Qin, its factional struggles, its assassinations, its constant external pressures from rival states that never stopped probing for weakness. And he learned with a ferocity and attentive intelligence that those around him found unsettling. Ancient accounts describe the young king as physically imposing. A strong build, a protruding chest, a voice described as harsh and grating, eyes described as those of a bird of prey. Sima Qian, whose records of the grand historian is the primary source for this period, describes him as a man with a tiger's, capable of enduring insults in the short term while calculating devastating responses in the long term. In 238 B8 BC, when Ying was 21, a crisis gave him the opportunity to demonstrate exactly what kind of ruler he would be. Lao Ai, a man Lu Bui had introduced into the court as a companion for the Queen Dowager, the emperor's mother, attempted a coup. He had used his position of intimacy with Queen Mother to accumulate titles, followers, and finally the audacity to believe he'd seize the throne itself. When Yingzheng crushed the revolt, his response was instructive. Lao Ai was executed by being torn apart by 5 horse-drawn chariots, one of the most agonizing forms of execution in the ancient world. His entire clan exterminated. His supporters were killed or mutilated. The Queen Mother was confined to a remote palace. Yingzheng's own half-brothers, children of the Queen Mother and the Lao Ai, were killed, reportedly beaten to death in sacks while the young king watched. Lu Bui implicated in the affair, was stripped of his position and sent into exile. 2 years later, receiving a letter that made clear the emperor had not forgiven him. He drank poison. He had created thing he could no longer control. Ying Zheng was now alone at the summit of Qin power. He was 23 years old, and he had a plan. Part 4. The Conquest. 10 years of fire. Between 230 and 230 and 201 BC, Ying Zheng conducted the most rapid and systematic conquests in the history of the ancient world. In 10 years, he destroyed 6 major states and united China under a single ruler for the first time in history. The scale and speed of what he accomplished is, by any military historical standard, extraordinary. But the human cost was measured in blood, on a scale that even his own era found exceptional. His strategy was not primarily military, though his generals, particularly Wang Jian and his son Wang Ben, were among the greatest commanders of the ancient world. Ying Zheng understood that the most powerful weapon available to him was not Qin army, but the Qin intelligence and diplomatic apparatus. He employed agents throughout the rival courts to sow dissension, bribe officials, move generals through false accusations of treason, and undemonize the polis before a single soldier crossed the border. Han fell first, 230 BC. The smallest of the remaining major states, already internally weakened, it capitulated with minimal resistance. Its king was taken prisoner and eventually executed. Then Zhao, in 228 BC. This was a harder fight. The memory of Changping still burning in Zhao's institutional consciousness. Their commanders determined not to be the generation that lost the state. The Zhao capital of Handan fell after a siege. The Zhao king was captured. A prince of Zhao escaped and led a desperate resistance from a northern enclave for several more years before that too was extinguished. Wei fell in 25 BC. The Qin general Wang Ben chose not to fight his way into the Wei capital. Instead, he diverted the Yellow River and flooded the city, drowning it. Ancient sources describe the capital city turned to its mud, its walls dissolving, its population drowned or starved into surrender. It is a story that may contain some exaggeration, but hydraulic siege warfare was practiced in this period, and the broad outline as is accepted by historians was the greatest challenge. The largest state by territory, vast and wealthy, with a tradition of fierce resistance. Wang Jian, the senior general, demanded a Mandarin army of 600,000 men before he would accept the commission. When Ying Zheng asked a younger general if fewer soldiers would suffice, the man said yes. 200 said yes, would be enough and be enough. And promptly he got beaten badly when he tried it. Wang Jian got his 600,000. Chu fell in 223 BC after 2 years of brutal campaigning. Yan fell in 222 BC. Yin fell into E2 BC for incident that reveals the personal hatreds the conquest generated. A young prince named Dan had sent an assassin, Jing Qi, to kill Yingzheng at court. The assassination had failed, nearly succeeding, but ultimately foiled when the emperor drew his own sword and wounded his attacker before the court could react. Yingzheng never forgot. When Yan fell, Prince Dan's head was delivered to the king court as part of the surrender terms. Qi, the last major state, fell in 221 BC. It's a lot of fight. Its king had been persuaded by a kin agent that peaceful submission would result in generous treatment. Did not. The Kui king was exiled to a remote location and deliberate to death, surrounded by pines and cypresses but denied food. He died of hunger. Into 201 BC, Yingzheng, age 38, was all China. By the reckoning of his court, something that had never existed before. He needed a new title. Part 5 of The First Emperor, Building a New World. The title he chose tells you everything about how he understood himself and his achievement. The kings of the old states, even the greatest of them, had styled themselves Wang King. Yingzheng considered insufficient. He instructed his ministers to devise a new title, and after deliberation, they proposed Huangdi. Huangdi, a compound of two terms, Huang, used for the mythological sage emperors of China's legendary Golden Age, and Dai, the supreme deity of the Shang dynasty religious system. Huangdi, August sovereign. Yingzheng added Shi. First, he was Qin Shi Huangdi, the first August sovereign of Qin. The implication was explicit and deliberate. There would be a second emperor and a third, and so on for 10,000 generations. The dynasty he was founding was, in his conception, permanent. History, of course, his dynasty would survive him by only 4 years. But the title stuck. Every ruler of China from that day to 1812 AD, across more than 1,000 years and dozens of dynasties, years the title he invented. The years following unification were years of frantic, totalizing reconstruction of Chinese civilization. Qin Shi Huang moved with the same dream-driven urgency that had characterized his military campaigns. Except Nali, the enemy, was not rival states, but difference itself. Difference in writing, in law, in weights and measures, in the width of carat at axles, in thought. The standardization of Chinese script was one of the most consequential acts in human cultural history. The Sen states had each developed variant writing systems over centuries of separation. Qin Shi Huang's Chancellor Li Si, a former student of the great legalist philosopher Shunzi, supervised the creation of a standardized script imposed across the entire empire. The consequences of this act ripple forwards to the present day. Chinese writings remains a unifying system across a land where the spoken dialects are so different as to be mutually incomprehensible. A Cantonese speaker and a Mandarin speaker cannot understand each other's speech, but they can read newspaper. This is in a direct line of cultural inheritance, the legacy of Li Tais and Qin Shi Huang. Weights and measures were standardized, the same units of length, volume, and weight used across an empire that stretched from the Yellow Sea to the borders of Central Asia. Cart axles were standardized to a uniform width, so that the wheel rotes worn into China's roads could be used by vehicles from any heart of empire. A logistical insight of startling modernity. A new currency was issued, round bronze coins with square holes. A designs practical and enduring that it remained the standard form of Chinese coinage for over 2,000 years. Part 6. Brick Wall, Monument and Graveyard. The Great Wall of China, as it exists today in the form that tourists photograph, and that has become one of the world's most recognized images, is largely of the Ming Dynasty, built more than 1,500 years after Shi Huang's death. But the Ming builders were following a template, reinforcing and extending that Qin Shi Huang had first realized a massive scale. Prior to unification, several of the northern states had built defensive walls along their borders with the steppe peoples, the Xiongnu, and related nomadic confederacies, whose cavalry raids were a persistent and devastating threat to settled agricultural civilization. After unification, Qin Shi Huang ordered these existing walls connected and extended into a single continuous barrier along China's northern frontier. He dispatched his greatest general, Meng Tian, northward with an army estimated at 300,000 soldiers, augmented by an unknown but certainly very large number of conscripted laborers and criminals. To accomplish this task, the construction conditions were, by any assessment, catastrophic for those so subject to them. The northern frontier was harsh terrain, mountains, desert, steppe. Supply lines stretched to their limits. Workers labored in extremes of heat and cold, without adequate food or shelter, under the supervision of military commanders, for whom efficiency of construction outweighed any consideration of worker welfare. Ancient sources describe mortality rates so high that the wall was said to be built on bones, that the bodies of workers who died simply incorporated into the structure itself. Modern archaeological investigation has not confirmed skeletal remains within the wall's fabric, but the image captures something true about the human cost. Estimates of deaths during the Qin wall building program range from of thousands to several 100,000 people. The story of Meng Jiangnu, one of the most beloved folk tales in Chinese culture, originates in this period. A young woman's husband is conscripted to build the wall. He dies there. She the wall-to-wall carrying winter clothes for him, only to be told he is dead. Her weeping is so intense, so inconsolable, that a section of the wall collapses, revealing her husband's bones. The tale is not historical, but it is true. It is true in the way that great folk stories are true. It preserves the emotional memory of a historical catastrophe, of hundreds of thousands of families separated from their men by the emperor's ambition. Part 7. The burning of the books. If the wall represents Qin Shi Huang's most spectacular act of state violence, of the books represents his most culturally catastrophic one. In 213 BC, following a court banquet at which scholars had publicly cited in precedent to criticize the emperor's policies, Li Si, the chancellor, proposed a solution of characteristic legalist efficiency: eliminate the precedents. His proposal was enacted almost in full. The imperial order required the destruction of all books in private books that did not relate to practical subject. Our culture, medicine, divination, the history of the Qin state itself, philosophy, poetry, history, of the 100 schools of thought that had flourished during the Warring's period, all of it was to be surrendered to local officials and burned. Anyone who failed to comply within 30 days was to be tattooed on the face and condemned to forced labor on the wall. Anyone who dared to discuss the condemned texts was to be executed in public. Anyone who used ancient precedent to criticize present policy was supalus, to be executed along with their entire family. The order was carried out. The bonfire of Chinese civilization's accumulated wisdom was not metaphorical. Books, bamboo strips bound with cord, silk scrolls, rolls, wooden tablets, collected and destroyed across the empire. The extent of the destruction is difficult to assess precisely, because as the primary sources we have were written after the fact and may exaggerate for dramatic effect. Some copies survived. The Imperial Library obtained official copies of the condemned texts, and scholars hid books at personal risk of their lives. But the damage was real and lasting. Works had existed for centuries were lost entirely. The intellectual tradition of the Warring's period, one of the most productive in human history, producing Confucius, Laozi, Zhuangzi, Xuangzi, Mozi, Hun Fei, and dozens of other thinkers of enduring significance, was deliberately and systematically attacked by the state. The burning of the books is remembered in China to this day as one of the defining cultural catastrophes of the nation's history. It is why, when the K dynasty's rival and successor, the Han dynasty, set about reconstructing Chinese civilization, the recovery of lost texts became a national project of the highest priority. Scholars were commissioned to reproduce from memory everything they could recall. Some works were reconstructed imperfectly. Many were gone forever. Part 8. Burrowing, these scholars, olive. If the burning of the books was not sufficient warning to China's intellectual class, what followed the next year made the emperor's intentions unmistakable. In 212 BC, Qin Shi Huang increasingly obsessed the search for immortality, and increasingly paranoid about those who served him. He Zheng ordered the execution of approximately 4660 Confucian scholars, who were buried alive. The background to this event involves the emperor's deepening engagement with occult and alchemical traditions. His terror of death, Qin Shi Huang was, by all accounts, deeply urgently afraid of dying, had led him to invest enormous resources in the search for the elixir of immortality. He dispatched expeditions to the mythical islands of the Eastern Sea, where immortals were said to live. Patronized alchemists and magicians who promised to deliver the secret of eternal life. He sent a fleet of ships eastward, under the command of an explorer named Neyu, carrying thousands of young men and women, with instructions to find the islands of the immortals. Xu Fu never returned. Later tradition claims he reached Japan, and the emperor never received his elixir. Two of the emperor's favored occultists, men named Hao Shang and Lu Shang, had taken enormous of the imperial treasury for their researches. Produced nothing, grown alarmed the emperor's increasingly volatile temperament, and fled. Before fleeing, they apparently discussed their patron among themselves with a candor that would prove catastrophic for others. They are recorded as saying, or at least this is what was reported to the emperor, that he was impossible to work for, suspicious, cruel, intoxicated with power, convinced of his own infallibility, incapable of honest counsel. When this reached Qin Shi Huang, his response was to order an investigation of the scholars at court. The investigation, which, as all such investigations in paranoid courts do, expanded far beyond its original scope, identified 460 scholars as guilty of deluding the people and of similar offenses. They were taken to a valley outside the capital and buried alive. Some ancient accounts suggest a more merciful end, that they were executed first and then buried, but the term used in the original sources is specific enough that the tradition of live burial is taken seriously by historians. The emperor's eldest son Fuzu, appalled by this act, remonstrated with his father. Qin Shi Huang's response was to send Fuzu away, to serve with the general mansion on the northern frontier, far from the capital, far from influence, far from chance of moderating his father's rule. Part 9. The emperor's paranoia and his palaces. By the final years of his reign, Qin Shi Huang had become something that the architecture of his own power had created. A man so isolated by fear and ceremony that he moved through the world like a ghost, invisible and omnipresent simultaneously. He had ordered the construction of a network of corridors and tunnels connecting his palaces, so to move unseen from one location to another, and he decreed that any official who revealed his current location would be put to death. He slept in a different room every night, attended only by a handful of trusted servants, his exact location unknown to all but the most intimate circle. The reason was not irrational. Multiple attempts had been made on his life, and none of them as heroically noble as Jing Qi's famous attack. Paranoia, in his world, had survival value. His building program was stupendous and, by the standards of ancient engineering, barely believable. The Apang Palace, begun on the empire, was fully consolidated and still incomplete. His death was described by later sources as covering an area of some 700 mu, roughly 112 acres, with a front hall alone large enough to seat 10,000 people. Modern archaeological surveys have confirmed the enormous scale of the foundations. Though the palace was burned shortly after the dynasty's collapse, and no structure survives, he also built a mausoleum. The complex at Mount Lai, near the capital, that employed over 700 workers, and that contained in its underground chambers a reproduction of the entire Chinese empire in miniature, with rivers of mercury flowing through the landscape, a ceiling mapped with the constellations in pearls, and an army of terracotta soldiers standing guard. That army, the famous terracotta warriors, discovered accidentally by farmers digging a well in 1974. Numbers somewhere between 8,000 and 9,000 individual figures, each individualized features, each carrying real weapons, organized in military formation, standing in underground chambers, designed to serve the emperor in afterlife. They are extraordinary. They are also a monument to a particular Kanoff megalomania, the belief the dead emperor would need an actual army to command in the next world, rendered in clay because the mass human sacrifice of earlier Chinese burial traditions had, by the Qin period, become politically untenable even for the emperor, although not entirely. The workers who built the mausoleum, those who knew the location of its secret passages and its treasures, reportedly be sealed inside when the construction was complete, to prevent them from revealing its secrets. If accurate, This represents the deliberate murder of thousands of people for the sake of a dead man's privacy. Part 10. Mercury, Immorti, Andy, Andres, and the supreme irony of Qin Shi Huang's life is that the very substances he consumed in his desperate search for immortality almost certainly hastened his death. By the final years of his reign, he was regular consuming pills and elixirs prepared by his court alchemists, preparations that modern analyses of the relevant ancient pharmaceutical traditions strongly suggests contained significant quantities of mercury. Mercury was central to Taoist alchemical theory of the period. The red mineral cinnabar, which is mercuric sulfide, was considered to contain the essence of vitality, and its processing and ingestion was believed to confer long life. What mercury actually confers, in chronic high doses, is a progressive neurological catastrophe, confusion, tremor, paranoia, loss of impulse control, erratic behavior, and ultimately organ failure. The increasingly volatile and irrational behavior that characterized Qin Shi Huang's final years, his murderous rages, his impossible demands, his nocturnal wanderings, his inability to trust anyone, is entirely consistent with chronic mercury poisoning, though we cannot not diagnose a man who died 2,200 years ago with any certainty. He died in 210 BC, aged 49, while all on one of the imperial inspection tours that he conducted periodically across his vast empire. He was at Shekyu, in what is now Hebei province, far from his capital. The immediate cause of death is not recorded with precision by the primary sources. He died suddenly or after a brief illness in the company of his youngest son, Huahai, and the chief eunuch, official Zhao Gaoao, Chancellor Li Xi. What happened next is a story of betrayal worthy of everything that had preceded it. Zhao Gao and Li Xi, recognizing that the emperor's eldest and ablest son Fusu, the one who had been sent away, criticized for criticizing the burial of the scholars, would almost certainly become emperor, and then very possibly execute them for their roles in his father's reign, conspired to suppress news of the death. They forged an imperial decree ordering Fusu and the general Mineral Meng Tian to commit suicide. Fusu, ever the obedient son, complied. Meng Tian refused, was imprisoned, and eventually killed. The youngest son, Huai, a weak and pliable young man of 20, became the second emperor. The imperial party traveled back to the capital with the body of the first emperor concealed in his, surrounded by carts of salted fish. The smells smelt the sampa. In the summer heat, it was, in its ghastly way, a final image worthy of the reign it concluded. The man who had demanded absolute power, surrounded by ceremony, attended by the machinery of state, traveling home, and in home, and entirely, absolutely, irreversibly powerless. Part 11. The dynasty that died bound founder Shi Huang had believed his dynasty would last 10,000 generations. It lasted 15 years after his death, 4 years after his own. The Qin dynasty, the most transformative political project in Chinese history, collapsed with a speed that astonished contemporaries and has fascinated ever since. The second Emperor Hu Hai was entirely controlled by Zhao Gao, who used his position to eliminate anyone he perceived as a threat, including, eventually, Li Si himself, who was arrested on fabricated charges of treason, and executed in 208 BC in punishment of being cut in half at the waist in the marketplace, a sentence so grotesque that it became one of the defining images of Qin tyranny in later Chinese historical memory. Li Si, the great architect of the unified empire, the man who had provided the stand of the script, and the burning of the books and the burial of the scholars, died in the same kind of arbitrary state violence he had helped construct. Zhao Gao himself met a fitting assassinated by the third emperor puppet he had installed, who was then himself forced to commit suicide when Kalarmi collapsed before the rebel forces converging on the capital from every direction. The last Qin ruler surrendered in 206 BC, offering himself up with a rope around his neck and the imperial seal hanging from it. The rebel general Xiang Yu, who received the surrender, had him executed shortly afterward. The Qin capital was burned. The Apang Palace, still under construction, was set alight and burned, according to some sources, for 3 months. The great mausoleum at mob length, looted it, its bronze weapons melted down, its terracotta army left to stand in the dark for 2,000 years, until the farmers of 1974 found them. The dynasty was over. Epilogue. The emperor would not die. And yet Qin Shi Huang, the man who failed at the one thing he most desperately wanted, who died at 49, despite everything, is in a real sense indelible. The word China, in most of the world's languages, derives from Qin. Subsequent Chinese dynasty ruled an empire whose fundamental architecture, its unified script, its administrative structure, its concept of imperial sovereignty, was his creation. When Chairman Mao Zedong told a group of intellectuals in 1958 that the first emperor had only buried 460 scholars, while his own government had buried 6,000, and that they accused him of being a second Qin Shi Huang. We have surpassed Qin Shi Huang a hundredfold. He was acknowledging, in a grotesque way, the template that persisted millennium. The terracotta army stands today in its climate-toned pits. Thousands of faces Look, the millions of tourists who come each year before them. Each face is different. Each soldier is an individual captured in clay at the height of kin power, positioned and guard an emperor who was already dying by the time they were finished. They do not look like monsters. They looked like men, ordinary men, young men, men who had families and names and fears and hungers, just like the scholars who were buried alive, just like the workers who built the wall, just like the soldiers executed at Changping. This, what makes Qin Shi Huang genuinely difficult to reckon with across the distance of time. He was not a force of nature or a mythological demon. He was a human being, one produced by extraordinary circumstances. Shibboleth, a philosophy of permanence of power that stripped compassion from governance and replaced it with efficiency, terrified of death in ways that made him more dangerous the more power he accumulated. He created things of lasting value. He destroyed things of irreplaceable worth. He killed people in numbers that are difficult to conquer. Abstraction. History does not permit the abstraction. Behind every number was a person. Behind every policy was a consequence that landed on a human body in a real place at a real time. This has been China's cruelest emperor, the world of Qin Shi Huang.